In the early years of the Pacific War, Japan's Mitsubishi G4M bomber, known to the Allies as the Betty, was one of the most feared aircraft in the skies. Sleek, fast, and possessing an extraordinary range for its time, it represented a unique Japanese approach to warfare. Speed and striking power were everything, and survivability was secondary. The Betty's first appearances in 1941 and 1942 were devastating. It struck fear into Allied forces from Malaya to the Philippines, sinking major warships and projecting Japanese air power far beyond the reach of most other bombers in the world. But beneath its impressive performance lay a hidden flaw that would doom it and thousands of the men who flew it. When American technical intelligence officers finally got their hands on an intact G4M in 1943, they were stunned by what they found and horrified by the price Japan had paid for its design philosophy. The Mitsubishi G4M was developed in the late 1930s when Japan's Imperial Navy demanded a bomber that could fly farther and faster than anything else in service. They needed a plane capable of reaching distant targets deep in the Pacific without relying on aircraft carriers or forward bases. Mitsubishi's engineers, led by Kiro Honjo, took that challenge seriously. The resulting bomber had elegant lines, a long wingspan, and twin engines that could carry it nearly 2,400 kilometers, an astonishing range for its time. But this came at a terrible cost. To save weight and extend range, the designers removed virtually all protective features. There was no armor plating to protect the crew, and most shockingly, the fuel tanks were not self-sealing. They were thin, unprotected containers of aviation fuel that ran through the wings, a disaster waiting to happen when hit by enemy fire. In Japan, this was seen as a necessary compromise. The Imperial Navy believed in the spirit of the airmen. Courage, skill, and the willingness to die for the emperor would overcome any material weakness. In contrast, American aircraft designers took the opposite approach. Planes like the B-17 Flying Fortress were built to bring their crews home even when riddled with bullets. Japanese philosophy favored offensive power and range over protection. As a result, the G4M became a symbol of both brilliance and tragedy, an aircraft that could strike anywhere but rarely return unscathed. When the war began in December 1941, the Betty's impact was immediate. During the Malayan campaign, it helped destroy much of the British air presence in Southeast Asia. But its most famous early victory came on December 10, 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor. Two British capital ships, the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse, had sailed north to intercept Japanese landings. They were accompanied by no fighter cover, trusting their heavy guns and anti-aircraft defenses to protect them. From bases in Indochina, Japanese Betty bombers armed with torpedoes attacked in waves. Despite fierce fire from the ships, the bombers pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. The results were catastrophic. Both ships were sunk, and over 800 sailors perished. It was the first time in history that capital ships at sea had been destroyed entirely by air power. The Betty had proven its worth. For a time, the G4M was the terror of Allied sailors and soldiers across the Pacific. It could strike far beyond the range of most fighters, dropping bombs or torpedoes on targets that thought themselves safe. But as the Allies recovered and began fielding superior aircraft, the Betty's weaknesses became painfully clear. Its lack of armor and unprotected fuel tanks made it a flying torch when hit. American and Australian pilots quickly learned that even a few .5 caliber rounds could set a Betty ablaze. Pilots began to nickname it the Flying Zippo, or one-shot lighter, a cruel but accurate reference to how easily it burned. By 1943, Allied forces had improved their intelligence operations and were eager to study enemy equipment. When a relatively intact Betty crash-landed in the Pacific that year, American technical intelligence officers examined it in detail. What they found shocked them. The bomber's fuel system was indeed completely unprotected, and its structure was astonishingly light, little more than thin aluminum skin stretched over a fragile frame. The plane's impressive range now made sense, but so did its high loss rate. Reports circulated among Allied airmen describing the Betty as fast but fragile. The discovery confirmed what fighter pilots already knew from experience. Once you hit a Betty, it was finished.
The tragedy of the G4M was not just mechanical, but human. Japan's bomber crews were some of the most skilled and disciplined aviators in the world, but they paid a horrific price for their government's priorities. Over 10,000 Japanese airmen lost their lives flying the G4M during the war. Many missions ended with the aircraft exploding in mid-air or crashing in flames before the crew could bail out. Survivors who were captured often expressed bitterness not at their enemies, but at their own command for sending them up in what they called coffins with wings. Yet, despite its flaws, the G4M remained central to Japan's war effort. It was the only long-range bomber capable of reaching Allied bases and naval forces spread across the vast Pacific. It participated in almost every major air operation from 1941 to 1945. The aircraft's speed and range made it ideal for carrying out one of the most infamous missions of the war, the assassination of Admiral Yamamoto. In April 1943, Yamamoto, the mastermind of the Pearl Harbor attack, was flying aboard a Betty bomber to visit forward bases in the Solomon Islands. Allied codebreakers intercepted his flight plan, and a squadron of U.S. P-38 Lightnings was dispatched to intercept him. The ambush succeeded perfectly. Yamamoto's Betty was caught in the air and riddled with bullets. It burst into flames and crashed into the jungle of Bougainville. The death of Japan's most respected naval leader was a crushing blow to morale, and once again demonstrated how vulnerable the Betty was to enemy fire. As Japan's situation worsened, the G4M's role evolved. It was adapted to carry experimental weapons, including the Yokosuka MXY-7 Ohka, a rocket-powered human-guided bomb. These piloted missiles were launched from Betty bombers at high altitude, allowing the Ohka to glide and then rocket toward Allied ships in kamikaze attacks. But the plan was flawed. The Bettys were slow and unprotected, and Allied fighters often destroyed them long before they could release their deadly payloads. Many missions ended with the entire bomber group annihilated, their Ohka weapons never used. It was a grim testament to Japan's desperation and to how far its technological advantage had decayed by 1945. Throughout the war, Allied pilots developed a grudging respect for the Betty's endurance and the courage of its crews. Despite overwhelming odds, Japanese airmen continued to fly their missions, often knowing they would never return. There are numerous accounts of Betty crews refusing to bail out, trying to guide their burning aircraft into enemy targets, or simply staying with their doomed comrades until the end. This fanatical dedication, born from a mix of loyalty, pride, and indoctrination, was both tragic and awe-inspiring. By 1944, the G4M was hopelessly obsolete. American fighters like the F-6 Hellcat and P-38 Lightning dominated the skies, and Japan's once superior bomber could no longer survive without heavy escort. Losses mounted at a staggering rate. Entire squadrons vanished in single missions, shot down in flames. Japan tried to improve the design with later variants, such as the G4M3, which added self-sealing tanks and better defensive armament. But these improvements came too late and were produced in too few numbers to make a difference. The empire's industrial base was collapsing, and fuel shortages meant that even surviving aircraft were often grounded. When Japan finally surrendered in 1945, few G4Ms were airworthy. Of more than 2,400 built, nearly all had been destroyed. The Betty had begun the war as a symbol of Japan's technological prowess and daring spirit. It ended as a symbol of the nation's flawed priorities, a machine that embodied the deadly trade-off between range and survival. The lessons learned from it were harsh but enduring. In post-war analysis, both Japanese and Allied engineers reflected on the G4M's legacy. American designers noted that Japan's focus on offensive capability gave it an initial edge, but its disregard for crew safety ultimately doomed its Air Force. The concept of balancing performance with survivability became a guiding principle for future generations of aircraft design. Even Japan's post-war aviation industry, when it was reborn in the 1950s, adopted new philosophies rooted in safety and durability rather than sacrifice.
The captured Betty, examined by American engineers in 1943, played a crucial role in understanding Japanese technology and tactics. Its dissection revealed not only design secrets, but also the mindset behind them. Reports from that investigation helped inform Allied strategies, emphasizing how to exploit the bomber's weaknesses. The discovery that Japan had deliberately avoided self-sealing fuel tanks was met with disbelief, but it explained the horrifying sight that many pilots described. Bettys that seemed to explode after a single burst, leaving long trails of black smoke and burning debris falling into the sea. In a broader sense, the story of the G4M Betty tells the story of Japan's air war as a whole. It began with triumph, evolved through desperation, and ended in self-destruction. The same ideals that had driven its early success, boldness, innovation, and sacrifice, also led to its downfall when pushed to extremes. The bomber's haunting silhouette became a symbol of both the brilliance and the blindness of Japan's wartime aviation philosophy. When one looks at wartime photographs of Betty bombers lined up on tropical airstrips, their sleek fuselages gleaming under the sun, it's easy to forget how deadly fragile they were. The men who flew them were often young, many barely out of their teens, trusting in their commanders and their machines. They flew long hours over endless ocean, with no radar, minimal protection, and the constant risk of fire. For them, the G4M was both a weapon and a coffin, and yet they took pride in it, calling it hamaki, the Japanese word for cigar, because of its long, tubular shape. Even when they knew it could ignite at any moment, they called it our Betty. Today, only a handful of Betty bombers survive in museums, silent reminders of that deadly balance between engineering brilliance and human cost. Visitors who look inside can see the thin metal skin, the sparse interior, and the gaping spaces where fuel tanks once sat, reminders of the decisions that defined a generation of war. In 1943, when American pilots finally captured and examined that first intact G4M, they gave it a nickname that would stick in aviation history: the Flying Death Trap. But even in that grim moniker lay a certain respect. The Betty had been deadly not only to its enemies, but to its own. It was a paradox, a machine born of genius and fatalism, carrying Japan's hopes across the Pacific only to burn them up in flame.
The story of the Betty is not merely one of a bomber. It is a story of a nation's values, its strengths, and its tragic miscalculations. In its aluminum skin and unarmored wings were reflected the ideals of an empire that valued reach over safety, honor over survival. And in the wreckage left behind across the islands of the Pacific, the world learned a harsh truth, that even the most advanced weapon is doomed if built on the sacrifice of those who must use it. The captured Betty bomber revealed all of this to the Allies, not just the technical details, but the human story written in its charred fuselage. It was a revelation that turned awe into pity and fear into understanding. And as the war rolled on towards its fiery end, the lessons of the Betty would echo across the skies, a haunting reminder that in war, technology without protection becomes tragedy, and courage without survival becomes loss.